26b 練習問題英日同時通訳
Thank you very much for your most kind introduction, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate this opportunity of being here and having such a large audience on a very important day for the Keio University. I understand you're playing, is it Hosei University? And I know that every single one of you would rather be out there in the stands rooting for your team. The fact that so many of you have foregone that particular much greater pleasure and are here this afternoon to hear somebody like me talk indicates that how much interested you are in this whole subject of international communications. And it is certainly a very great, gratifying experience to have this opportunity to discuss this matter with you a bit this afternoon. I also feel especially honored to give a talk of this kind on this campus because, as you know, one of the most historic symbols of communication is here on this campus. Your great founder, Fukuzawa Yukichi, established the first public speaking hall in Japan called the Enzetsukan. Realizing how important communication is in the development of a modern democratic nation. And I also feel, therefore, that you have this kind of historic background on this campus, on the basis of which you almost subconsciously understand the importance of the subject of communication. Now, when we talk about communication, we usually think about language. That language is the way that we communicate with people. It is true that we use language to communicate with people, but we also communicate by many other types of behavior besides the spoken language. The way I stand here communicates something to you. If I slouch over like this, I probably communicate to you that I'm a very sloppy person. I am lazy. I am probably tired. But if I stand straight and I smile and throw my shoulders back, I might try there through this kind of behavior to communicate to you that I am healthy, I am full of vigor, and I'm very eager. And so just my own physical attitude, the way I stand, my posture, the expression on my face, all of these things communicate something to the people who watch me. The whole attitude of a person also communicates very much a message to the other person. If the attitude of an individual is rather cynical, if he sneers, if he has a frown on his face all the time, that kind of an attitude will certainly communicate a message to the other person which says, this communicator, that particular individual, is not a pleasant person. He is probably very pessimistic. Perhaps I had better not bring up this subject with him because he will always say something negative. So that without the individual saying a word of language, the person's attitude may immediately communicate a particular message to the other person, making that other person behave accordingly. On the other hand, if the person is smiling, he is pleasant, and he's ready By the expression on his face, he appears that he is eager to listen. If he has that kind of a positive attitude, naturally, the other person who meets him will probably wish to talk with him. If this other person has a problem that he thinks this individual may have some suggestions of an answer for, he may be willing to talk about these problems with him. So that everything that we do, the way we walk, the way we stand, the way we hold our expressions on our faces, everything that we do, in addition to language, communicate many, many things to other people. Now, if this is the way that we do communicate many things to our friends as individuals, then naturally, I think that we communicate similar things to other nations as a nation. In the same way, I think that we Japanese as a nation have communicated many, many things to other countries. And we may say, all right, what has Japan communicated? Well, one of the ways to find out what we have communicated is to look at how other nations see us. In other words, if we listen to what, let us say, an American says about Japan, or a Southeast Asian says about Japan, this is one indication of the kind of messages we have communicated to him. And in general, the image that most Western nations have, and particularly the United States has, about Japan is that Japan is a very, very modern nation. And so we say, are you sure? Oh, yes, we're sure. Japan is a very modern nation. Why? Well, my goodness, they'll say, in the United States, look at all the automobiles you're selling us. Look at all the television sets. Look at all the tabletop computers you're selling us. This is to say nothing about textiles. The millions of tons of steel that you produce, you're the biggest shipbuilder in the world, have been for the last 15 years or so, perhaps 10 years, yes, at least 10 years, maybe more than 10 years. The largest shipbuilding nation in the world is Japan. All these modern things about Japan show me, says the American, that Japan is a very modern nation. He may also say, I have visited Japan, and I have stayed in some of your nicest hotels in Tokyo and in Osaka. And they're beautiful hotels, they'll say. And but then he'll say, now, something puzzled me. I went into a bank, and I tried to cash a check, and they wouldn't do it. And then he will say, now, I thought all modern banks cash checks, but Japanese banks don't. I wonder why. Well, you see, to this American, this bank had communicated something to him. And perhaps the image that this American got of a Japanese bank was an image that was somewhat similar to the image of an American bank. He walks through the automatic door, and he sees nice marble surfaced walls, very modern facilities, an open counter that is very modern in design, computers, all these facilities the same as in an American bank, except that usually at an American bank, the teller's window is usually partitioned off with some glass partitions, and there's a little glass partition like this But that's about the only difference. So the American says, ha-ha, this is just the same as an American bank. Well, if it's an American bank, I ought to get American service. So he goes there and he demands American-style service, but he gets Japanese-style service. Now, I am not saying, don't mistake me, I am not saying that Japanese-style service is worse than American-style service. In many ways, it is the other way around. Japanese banks give various kinds of services that one cannot get in American banks. On the other hand, there are other kinds of services American banks give which the Japanese banks do not. Those are some of the differences, but that does not mean that one is better than the other. But to this American, at first, he does not think of these differences, simply because the physical facilities have communicated a message to him which he receives. One more thing. Of course, in communication, you have a transmitter and a receiver. And what we have in this communication chain is, now I have been talking mainly about this side here, the way that we have transmitted messages to the other side. However, when I spoke about this American in a Japanese bank, the bank transmitted something to this receiver, but it was received with quite something else. And so, now let us talk about the receiver here. This receiver, in the form of this American individual or in the form of the American people, have made some interesting assumptions. One assumption about this American visitor is that as soon as he sees something that is modern, he thinks that is Western. And if he is an American, he thinks that is American. Now, if he were a German, he would say, oh, he would think this is a German. Or if he were British, he might think it was British. In other words, the mistake that many people make is that modernization is Westernization. Many people think, therefore, that Japan is Westernized. Everything is Westernized. Well, this is not the case. Now, most of us here are wearing clothes. I shouldn't say most of us, all of us here are wearing clothes that are Western in origin. These are Western-style clothes that we are wearing. So that our clothing, we can say, is Westernized. But the fact that we may have driven here in an automobile or rode or had ridden the modern electric train here is not Westernized behavior. It is modern behavior. It is not Western behavior. Modern roads, a modern bank, the exporting of automobiles, color television, these are all tools of modernization, but they are not tools of Westernization. And so this is one rather serious mistake that the amateur observer of Japan makes. That modernization is the same as Westernization. Now, if the individual makes this mistake, then he is more inclined to make other mistakes about Japan. And this is what happens. When the Americans look at Japan and they see that Japan has the highest growth rate in the world in GNP, and that already now Japan is number 3 in the world of having the largest gross national product, the second largest in the free world, and that she is very rapidly expanding her exports and her imports, that her trade expansion is the highest in the entire world, that she has been by far the biggest shipbuilder in the world, much bigger than England. England lost out many, many years ago, much bigger than Sweden and these other great shipbuilding nations. That she is producing so much steel that before long she will produce just as much steel among 100 million people in Japan as the United States does among 200 million people. If an American looks at Japan in these terms and thinks that modernization is westernization, he is going to be making a very serious error. And that is this, that Japan is totally westernized, Japan is totally modern, and therefore the Japanese people should behave like Westerners, like modern Western people. And they try to deal with us in this way. In the United States, most Americans will probably assume that Japanese companies do business exactly the same as American companies do. One American businessman who has been here for many decades said to me once that he said that the major portion of his time is taken up in trying to explain the difference between Japanese ways of doing things and American ways of doing things in order to convince his home office in New York City that they are dealing with a different kind of business in Japan. Almost every business dealing that he gets into requires this kind of communication. He needs to be a bridge, in both directions. He has to explain to the Japanese how the American business firm operates and what its attitude is, and why it is that way, and why do the Americans take this approach. Then he turns around, and to his home office in New York, he has to write papers and letters and send telegrams and get on the telephone, spends all this time explaining to the American side why the Japanese do things the way the Japanese do. And I think that a number of American businessmen or European businessmen who live here in Tokyo or in Osaka, these other places, have to spend a great deal of time to bridge this gap of understanding, even among businesses that are working together and have mutual interests. There is still this very serious gap of communication. So for the ordinary man in the street, or for the bulk of the general public in the United States, Japan may look to them like a nation that is quite different from the kind of nation that we think Japan is, as Japanese. Now, these things perhaps are in the background of a number of difficulties between the United States and Japan on economic matters. I do not pretend that communication is the only problem in American-Japanese relations in the field of economics or in the field of politics or these other places, but I suspect that the communication problem is a very important factor in our negotiations and in our relations. Now, one of the outstanding I would say one of the outstanding differences between the American people and the Japanese people is that in Japan, although we have a very free democracy and we feel that we are all equal, we nevertheless have a very important social relationship, one with another, which is mainly vertical in nature. Now, you probably have read various books on this subject. Recently, there have been a number of books that have been published in Japanese on this very subject. Professor Nakane of Tokyo University some years back wrote a book in English on the vertical relationship of Japanese society, and she also produced this in Japanese. And she calls our society a vertical society, in contrast to the horizontal society of the West. Now, the vertical relationship is not the only relationship in Japan. There is also a very important horizontal relationship. But the emphasis is mainly in the vertical. In other words, a young boy grows up at home and he is taken care of very well by his parents. The young boy grows up expecting his parents to take care of him, so he looks to them for support, expects their support, leans on them very heavily. And there's been a book written about that, too, by Dr. Doi of St. Luke's Hospital, that you probably already know. The attitude of being dependent on somebody. The Japanese people, we are usually very much dependent on certain groups or certain individuals, and our security lies in this dependency. And this is the way we grow up. Now, when the young boy grows up and he gets a younger brother, the older brother takes care of the younger brother, and they grow up this way. He goes to college, and the professor takes care of the student. And then when he gets out of college and he gets a job, and he usually gets it through the school, he gets a job, he gets into the company, and the section chief then takes care of this particular young employee. And the section chief may say, this young employee is a very fine-looking, intelligent, fine young man. I know just the young girl, the right kind of young girl who ought to be a good wife for him. So he goes over and he tells his friend about who's got this nice daughter, about this young man, and pretty soon, you know, the young boy and this young girl are going out on dates together or something, and well, that's wonderful. You don't have to go out and make your own dates, you know. Somebody else makes it for you. Now, if you told this to an American college boy, he would say, good grief, no, I don't want anybody making dates for me. I'll go after my own date. But for many of us Japanese, even today, there is this expectancy that while we will also look around for our, if we boys, I'm no longer a boy, I'm a grown man, but anyway, let us say I'm still a boy, that we boys will be, although some of us, we boys will look around for girlfriends, we half expect that somebody else will also help us in this relationship. And the girls too, you know. The girls are hoping that, well, someday there'll be a nice young man who will propose to her. But she says, well, you know, perhaps my parents will find somebody for me, or perhaps my uncle will know somebody who's, you know. Well, in the United States, this is almost unthinkable. But this is one of the aspects of the vertical relationship in Japanese society, which holds even today. And this tradition, which still remains, is quite different from the relationships that exist in the United States. Now, I do not say that one system is better than the other. I don't think that one is any better than the other. It is merely true that one is different from the other. That's the only, they're just different, that's all. The Americans look upon us now as a very modern nation, very modern people, and again, Western in many ways, to such an extent that they say, well, in many ways they're just like us, and they have a very high standard of living and so on. They are a strong nation, just the same as West Germany, or France, or Italy, these European nations. So there's a greater sense of equality with the Japanese than there used to be. The Americans feel that we Japanese are their equals, much more strongly now than they used to do. But when an American thinks about equality, he thinks not only about equal status, but he also thinks about not only equal rights, but in addition, equal responsibilities. And when an American thinks about equal responsibilities, I imagine that in his mind, he is thinking about the billions of dollars of foreign aid that his government has given, the heavy taxes that they are paying, the trade relationship now, where they are now very badly in deficit in their international balance of payments, and all of these things. And they're saying, well, equal responsibility means that Japan ought to share some of these things too in this world. Now, rightly or wrongly, the Americans have assumed that the major reason for the troubles that they are in today, financially and in other ways, has been that the Americans have taken the major responsibility throughout the world in trying to maintain stability and economic progress. And so in terms of international stability and economic progress internationally, they have felt that they have shared a very large proportion of the responsibility, which now they think that Germany and Japan in particular, these two nations, ought to start sharing more of. Now, this is only one dimension of the kind of responsibility that the American may have in mind when he thinks about equality. But from our standpoint as Japanese, we Japanese probably, when we think of equality, we think of equal rights first. Rights first. Probably we think of equal status second. And equal responsibility probably is a very, very small third. It has not quite been made clear in our minds because, and I don't think that we should be blamed for it, it just happens to be our international experience. Over the last 20 to 25 years after the war, our international experience has been such that we have not had to take much international responsibility. And so when we think of being equals, in the past we have always thought of ourselves as inferior. Now, in actual fact, we were not inferior, but we thought we were inferior. And as long as we think we are inferior, and if we are accustomed to this vertical relationship, we say the superior person is the one who should take responsibility. The inferior person has to depend on the superior person to take care of him. And we have still probably a residue of this attitude today towards the other countries of the West, and particularly the United States. And so in many problems of negotiations that you read about in the newspapers in these days, where the reaction in Japan is very negative, much of that emotion may be due to this basic feeling that we are suddenly made to take on a much bigger responsibility than we are ready for. While on the American side, the Americans think, well, they ought to be ready. My goodness, they've had, 20 years to, and over the last 10 years or so, they have been flourishing. As a matter of fact, for the last 15 years, they have been prospering like everything. It's high time they were taking responsibility, you see. And so there's a great gap of assumption, the American assumption and the Japanese assumption. And the communication gap can also be in some ways called a great gap in assumptions or a great gap in expectations.